Okay, it's time to begin our service. One of you being here, each person that's represented. And let me tell you that tonight, your speaker that's scheduled in your bulletin is not the speaker that's here. Because Sunday afternoon, we got a message from Chase, and he had informed us that the speaker that was scheduled had COVID and was not going to be able to be with us. So we, the elders, got real busy, and we began to think who we could call on such a short notice to come and speak to us tonight. And Harry made the suggestion, well, I don't know if you can get him or not, but Tim Parrish would be a good speaker. And so I said, well, I've got his number in my phone. And so we called him, and he didn't answer, but I got his voicemail, and I left him a message. And I wasn't sure that was going to work, so I called Joan later on, and I wanted to know if that number was good that I'd called and left a message on. She said, well, I think so. So about 9 o'clock, Tim called Joan and told her that I'd called him, and that he was in, I believe, Memphis. He can tell you where he was at, but anyway, he couldn't answer the phone, and so he wanted to make sure that I knew that he was glad to be able to come and speak to us in the speaker's place. So we've got Tim Parrish with us tonight, and at the appropriate time, Tim's going to come and speak. And so we're so thankful that he agreed to that on short notice. I know oftentimes you're given some time to, get yourself ready and get your material ready and everything, but Tim, I think will do a good job. We're grateful. I've got a few announcements. This is concerning the Magi. Of course, that's coming up. Don't forget it. And there's 2 boxes of shirt on the benches back there that needs to be in the foyer, that if you want some, they need to be folded. And we need to get them back by Sunday morning. So if you can, pick some of those up and carry them with you tonight, fold them up, and let's get those ready for packing. On our sick list, I don't have any new updates on the sick except Lee Russell. He's with the Tennessee Highway Patrol, and he flies the helicopter, and he was the one that was killed in the helicopter crash yesterday. And his family is from the McKenzie area. They were, I think, some of them dentists down there, and Lee and his family were well known. And we want to extend our prayers to Lee and his family. Order of our service tonight, William will lead a song or two, and then we'll have prayer, and then Tim will be ready. William?
All right, so we'll do two songs and then our prayer. So our imitation song will be 272. That'll be our imitation song after the lesson. Now you'll turn with me to number 1. Number 1, we'll sing the first, second, and last verses of number 1.
Well, good evening. Ooh, that is live. Sorry, Shane. Corey, I called you your brother. Forgive me for that, too. I could have called you worse, I guess. I'm glad to be here tonight. I apologize if I seem a little bit scattered. I'm a little out of the habit, and that's not a bad thing. Many of you know that last year in July, I resigned from my work with the Huntington Church, and I had absolutely no idea what was next. I didn't really fancy the idea of moving somewhere else, and so that kind of eliminated the idea of looking for another preaching job immediately. And without going into too much detail that you don't care about, at that point I knew that stepping away for a moment was what I needed to do for my own spiritual health, for my own physical health, for my own mental health, for my family's sake. No, there weren't awful things happening. I wasn't in danger of being fired. I didn't do some horrible thing, though rumors quickly circulated around town that I had a girlfriend and that I stole money from church. I didn't get any money, and I have yet to meet my girlfriend. So if you heard those things, you heard them along with me. No, sometimes things, change is necessary. Things need to happen, even if you don't understand exactly why they need to happen. For a while, I went up the other side of the Court Square in Huntington and worked with Andrew Maddox at Maddox Insurance. I got my licenses to sell home and auto insurance, to sell life insurance, to sell commercial insurance. And I did that for a while, and it was fine, and it paid the bills in the meantime, but it just wasn't where I knew I needed to land. And I still didn't know where that was going to be, but I just knew that wasn't it. It's fine. I sold myself some insurance, so obviously I thought I was a good salesman, but it just wasn't where I knew I needed to land for something longer term. But still not really interested in looking at a move that would take me somewhere else. I've had some contact from some churches over the last year or so. I'm grateful for that. I'm humbled by that. But those are just not the opportunities that I believed I needed to step into. So I kept waiting, praying, being patient, because I trust the Lord, and I know most of you probably do too. And sometimes you learn to trust the Lord in those moments when you have no idea what the direction is going to be. And I think those are real good moments in our lives. And it was real good for me. At the same time, may I say it was very disorienting, because for 30 years I had been the preacher. That's what I had been. I started when I was 15, right down the highway at Holiday Chapel, Westport, Yuma. And in fact, the first baptisms I ever participated in, we came right here to this baptistry from Yuma and baptized Mitchell Wood and Amanda Wood within about a week of each other, and that was exciting for me. So this is all I'd ever known. It's the only life I'd ever been a part of. And so I just kept praying, God, wherever you can use me, just help me not be so dense that when you open that door, I miss it. And so you just keep praying that. It's a little scary prayer to pray, by the way, because if you just really say, Lord, whatever you want to do with me, you better mean that, because sometimes the Lord will put you in places that you didn't imagine being. Well, this is not a joke, literally, and I already quit my insurance job a long time ago, so Andrew can't fire me now for saying this, but I was sitting in my office at Maddox Insurance, and I had my computer open to Indeed.com. Now, for those of you that are not super web people, it's the classified ads for today. I was looking for a job, and I didn't know what I was looking for. I had no idea what kind of jobs were available to me, and every day for 2, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, I'd come home and say to Dana, what do you think about this? You think I could do this? Well, yeah, she said, you could do that. Yeah, that'd be all right. But never anything that I came home with, and she said, that's it. You got to do that. I called and inquired about a couple of jobs that were way different from anything I'd ever done before, and those people were kind enough to say, are you kidding? And so that didn't work out, And the last day, I'm scrolling Indeed.com, and I notice an ad for a hospice chaplain. And I thought, now that might not be here by coincidence. And I went home and I talked to Dana about it. And I prayed on it and I slept on it. And I got up the next morning and I told Dana when I left the house that day, I said, I'm going to send my application in today. I'm going to apply. I don't know any details, but I'm going to apply. I got online, filled out the application. 3 minutes from the time I hit the button to send that application, my phone rings. And it ends up being a person that I've known for a good portion of my life who happens to be the director of the Paris office for Avalon Hospice. And she said, is this really you? And I said, yeah, is this really you? And she said, yes. When can you start? And I said, well, let's talk about the job a little bit first. And she said, no, I'm just really interested in when can you start? We did talk for a while. Again, I took a little bit of time to think it over, but it didn't take a long time. And it has been a wonderful experience since then. I think it was maybe April that I accepted a job with Avalon. I was really nervous about talking to Andrew, though, because Andrew gave me a job when I didn't have one, and I hadn't been there that long, and he'd helped, put me through my education and training. And so I went in and sat down with him so nervous. And I told him, I need to talk to you about something. And he said, I've known from day one that you were not going to stay here. I said, why did you hire me? He said, well, I thought you could make me some money in the meantime. He said, I knew this wasn't a permanent fit for you. And we had a very good parting with each other. So now I work every day, spending my time with people who have terminal diagnoses. Some of those people are really close to death. In fact, some of those people I meet one time, and within a few days, their life on the earth ends. Don't get to have much relationship with those folks. It's really just kind of a first meeting. We pray together, and that's about that. But some of our folks are able to experience early admission, and we're able to stay with them for a long time and really begin to build some relationships. And that's happening already. And some of those people, as they die, I'm grieving those people already, and some days it's really, really, really heavy. I met with a patient yesterday who kind of opened the conversation, not so much by telling me he was suicidal, but by telling me he had really been doing some research on what would happen if he just stopped using his feeding tube. Because he's in that bad a shape, and he said, I don't like what I see in my future. You think that's not a heavy thing to start the day with? And this guy's normally funny and laughing and making jokes. And by the end of our time together, he was. But that was weighing really heavy on him. The whole day yesterday was like that. Every visit was heavy. And every visit, we're talking life and death kind of stuff. But I feel like in many ways my whole life prepared me for this job. And I don't mean to sound whatever that sounds like. Cliche or whatever. I don't mean for it to, be some kind of mystical thing. But from a very young age, I have known death and dying. Y'all know our family, and growing up in the family I grew up in and the place I grew up in, I've known death and dying for a long time. It's always been a part of my personal story, and it continues to be a part of my personal story. My family has experienced loss upon loss upon loss upon loss, and that affects you. That shapes you, that molds you and does things internally to you that nothing else will do. I spent some time in mortuary school. In fact, I was very close to graduation from Gupton College as a funeral director embalmer, and decided that just wasn't how things needed to go for me either. But working in and around death was not foreign to me. And this is the same way. I'm not uncomfortable being in difficult situations. I'm not uncomfortable talking to people about death and dying, about their souls, about their mortality, about my own mortality. Because when you talk with people every day, we're all dying, right? We all are dying every day. We know we are. Some closer than others, it would seem, but we're all dying. But when you talk to people who've had a doctor tell them, within just a few months or weeks, your life will be over. Well, that does a lot to your perspective. All right, now, you may be wondering, is this guy ever going to preach, or is he just going to tell stories about his new job? I promise you, in my brain, this was the introduction, okay? Here's why. What changed for me really was my perspective on death and dying, and on conversations about death and dying. Because when you're confronted with it every day, It's not that it doesn't become a big deal. It's a big deal every day. But you get to a place where you know, man, we'd all be a lot better off if we could talk about this. Your perspective changes, right? Well, I want to talk to you tonight about Saul. And you've been talking through this summer series about some people who have encountered Christ and have encountered the gospel and the differences and the change that's made in them. And I want to suggest to you tonight as we talk about a guy that alternatively we'll call him Saul and Paul, and I apologize because that may get a little tricky tonight because we're going to talk about another Saul too. And so we got two Sauls and one Saul that's also Paul, and just bear with me, okay? Just know at the end we have talked about Saul, and hopefully the conclusions will make sense for either one. But what I think really happens with Saul of Tarsus, the guy we later call Paul, on the road to Damascus, is a change of perspective. Because you see, before his encounter with Jesus, we see Saul, please don't think this is flippant, we see Saul as a bit of a super Jew. Right? He is a Jew among Jews. If the Jews had a contest for who was the most Jewish Jew, Saul would have won it. Because Saul's whole life had been built around his faith. Now, it's easy to miss that. So sometimes we get into the business of persecution and the bad things that he did and the stoning of Stephen and some of these things, and we think that's the image we have. But I want you to understand, please understand, that Saul of Tarsus was an incredibly religious man. He did everything he could to be as faithful as possible to what he believed God wanted him to do. Nothing that he did, well, let me hit the pause button there. Start to say nothing. Almost nothing that he did was motivated from a selfish place. It was motivated from a zealous faith. He believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He believed in a God who had parted the Red Sea. He believed in a God who would one day send a Messiah to redeem Israel, to save the world. He believed that so much that he was willing to do anything in order to be a part of that story. And that's where we meet him. When we meet him with Stephen, and they're putting their coats at his feet, and he is in hearty agreement, Dr. Luke tells us, with the death of Stephen. He really thought it was what should happen. When we meet him, we meet an incredibly religious, faithful Jew. And it's really difficult. May I just insert this thought here too? That a lot of times, and I even heard it, I was listening to a podcast today and I heard somebody say this. A lot of times we talk about Saul and his name being changed, and we kind of mix some things in our Bibles and we say that God changed his name from Saul to Paul, except that didn't really happen. God did change a few people's names in Scripture, Peter being one of those, but one of the things that happens here is that Saul is Saul before he meets Jesus, and he's still Saul after. It's what Jesus actually calls him. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? That's what Jesus calls him. Later on, as Paul begins to fulfill his mission among the Gentiles, as he finds himself in increasingly Gentile areas, working among increasingly Gentile audiences, where Judaism is not the prominent way of thinking, and the Jewish culture and the Hebrew culture is not the dominant culture, at some point we just read that Saul, who is also called Paul, and then it goes on. And from that moment on in the biblical narrative, he's never called Saul again. He's always called Paul. But the rest of his ministry is among almost exclusively Gentile groups. Now, there's still Jews all through there, and we meet them throughout the epistles. There's still a lot of Jewish people there, but his call, his mission, was to go to the Gentiles, and it makes sense that it's going to be a little bit easier. In fact, he even tells us one time, I became all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Paul said, if my name, Saul, is going to be a barrier, because it is such an obvious Jewish name, if it's going to be easier for me to not offend people and to navigate these other communities by dropping Shaul or Saul and going by Paulus, then that's what I'm going to do. And I really think that's as complicated as that gets. But let's not be guilty of saying that God changed his name, certainly not on the road to Damascus, because when he and Jesus talked, Jesus calls him Saul. Now, let's back up for a moment, okay? Trying to watch carefully. Let's back up for a moment. I love when there are these patterns, these blueprints, these things that show up in Scripture where God does one thing and then he does it again and then he does it again. Right? God is a master. And if you have ever really sat down with the book of Genesis, I mean really sat down, especially if we were able to read it with a little bit more of an Eastern mindset. That's hard because we're not Eastern people. We're Western people, influenced by a couple thousand years of Western thought. But if we thought more Eastern, there is so much just in the book of Genesis where God does these things in patterns and where the Bible is written with these interchanging things that we can miss them almost in sometimes even in English because they're devices that use the Hebrew alphabet and all these things. But there's all these patterns. Now, sometimes because I love those things, it's easy for me to imagine a pattern, to imagine that God is doing that kind of thing even if God is not. So may I say, before we go any farther, I don't know if what I'm about to tell you is something God did on purpose or it just is. I'm okay either way. If God did it on purpose, I think it's great because God sometimes does that. I don't think God is a coincidental God. So if this is here because it's supposed to be here, if it's whatever, I think there are some amazing similarities and coincidences, if you want to call them that, between the first Saul that we know in Scripture and the Saul of the New Testament. We'll call him King Saul and Saul of Tarsus, just to help keep them separate. Okay? Let me give some of these to you. We're not going to spend a lot of time here, I promise, because once I knew what I was speaking about, I really kind of got hung up in this. And so I'm going to try not to hang you up here tonight, but I want you to see this just because I think it's neat. And sometimes being able to connect characters and narratives throughout the bigger biblical story is a pretty neat thing to do. So let's run real quick with 3 or 4 of these things, okay? Number 1, both King Saul and Saul of Tarsus just happen to be Benjamites. They are from the tribe of Benjamin. And if you know anything about Jewish people, everything was based off that genealogy. Who you were, where you came from, what was your tribe, who was your father and your grandfather and your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. That was so valuable. And we know it's a part of what God does to bring Jesus into the narrative, right? We see that as it plays out. Well, both of these, 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 21 tells us that when Saul is selected to be the first king, despite multiple warnings that said, you really don't want a king, when he was chosen to be the king, we read that he is from the tribe of Benjamin. And when we get to Philippians chapter 3, Saul of Tarsus tells us about himself as he gives his pedigree, when he gives his resume, the things that make him a Jew among Jews. One of the things he says is, don't miss the fact that I am from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, does it mean anything? Does it connect the two? I don't know, but let's move on. Both of these men, King Saul and Saul of Tarsus, are what we might call transitional figures. King Saul is moving from the time of the judges into a time of kings. And on us, that's probably kind of lost because we have not lived through such a monumental shift in government. Whatever we think about, whatever shifts in government we've seen, for a long, long time, our government has looked basically the same. Now, we have a fairly young nation and a fairly young government if you look at the scope of world history. This was a major change from a time when there had not been a king among the people of God to a time when now there will be a king for a long time. And a lot of bad stuff is going to come. This is really a transitional moment. We know that it doesn't work out well for the first King Saul. But nonetheless, he is a bit of a transitional king. Saul kind of represents the same thing. Because up to the point of Cornelius, everything that you read about Jesus and the church is centered in the Jewish faith. everything. And I know we sometimes want to kind of move on past the things of Judaism, but we've got to remember that Jesus himself was a Jew who came and lived a very Jewish life, and his first followers were Jews. And the people in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, yeah, those people were Jews. Even if they were from other places, they were there because they were Jewish. And so we can't miss the fact that everything is really, really oriented around the descendants of Abraham, the physical descendants of Abraham, more specifically then Isaac, then Jacob. Okay, we see that. But when Paul is commissioned, when Saul is commissioned by Jesus, one of the things he's told pretty early is that he has a mission, and he comes to understand that his mission is to take the gospel of Jesus as the Messiah, the fulfillment of everything that God has ever done. And he's going to point that over now to a group of people that formerly had been on the outside. They were excluded. Jews didn't associate with Gentiles. Jews didn't eat with Gentiles. Jews most certainly did not worship in close proximity to Gentiles. And the preaching of the gospel is going to tear that wall down. And so you look at Saul of Tarsus, and he is very much that transitional figure that's kind of right there in the middle of that and begins to bridge together Jews and Gentiles. For most of us who are not Jewish in our ethnicity, we are thankful for that bridge and that transition. Moving right along. Both of these guys, in their own way, at the right time, if you look at them, show us some humility. Do you remember when Saul was first chosen? Now, if you want to go back and read about the beginning of Saul's reign, 1 Samuel chapter 9 is where you need to go. We're not going to spend a lot of time switching back and forth because you're going to tear a page in your Bible if you do that too quickly. But 1 Samuel chapter 9 is where we're bringing a lot of this from. And again in chapter 9, verse 21, when it came time to call him, he didn't think much of himself. Everybody else did. He had a good reputation. He was very well thought of. But he didn't think so much of himself at that point. Now, by the end of his reign, he's filled with pride, but not in the beginning. In fact, if you remember, he went and hid when they came to get him. He found a pile of suitcases and got in among those suitcases and thought maybe they wouldn't notice. But he was a big dude and he was hard to hide, and God was in this thing anyway. And so Saul is very much someone who illustrates in the beginning a bit of humility. And that's important. Saul of Tarsus is a guy whose humility, I think, is developed as he grows. Now, I don't want to pick on him, but in his early days, I think he was pretty proud of himself. I think pride might have been one of his struggles. Because when he talks about all the things that made him who he was, man, he just rattles that stuff off, right? It is not hard for him to give you his bullet points of what makes him him. But as he goes through his life, he even, when he talks about his thorn in the flesh, whatever that was, don't know. Anybody tells you they know for sure is lying. They don't know for sure. They write books and tell you that they do. They preach sermons and tell you they do. And they got some good guesses, all right, but the Bible didn't tell us that. And I'm quite certain the Lord hadn't revealed it to any of those other people either. But one of the things he says is because the greatness of the message of the gospel was so great, something had to help me stay humble. And so this satanic messenger was put in my life to keep me from exalting myself too much. One of the things when he's talking to Timothy and to Titus about the kind of men that will shepherd the church, what's he guarding? What's he caution them against, among other things? That these not be prideful people. Because I think he had come to understand how pride might have gotten in his way early on in his life. They were both really highly thought of. I mentioned that to you already. Now, this is a stretch, but this is one of my favorite comparisons, okay? They both, at some point in their life, fell down on the ground before somebody that was already dead. Fact. If you go to 1 Samuel chapter 28, there's some trouble going on with the Philistines. Samuel is dead already. And King Saul is inquiring for a word from the Lord. He wants God to tell him what to do. He wants God to tell him how this is going to work out. And he prays and he tries to get a word from the Lord, and he asks for one, and God is silent. Now, that should have probably been his answer, right? But he doesn't stop there. He goes and finds a medium. Now, some of our Bibles, if we grew up on the King James, we grew up knowing this woman was a witch. Now, that probably conjures all kind of images in our minds from childhood stories about witches. And don't think of somebody in a pointy hat with a wart on her nose, okay? But this is a woman who seems to have some sort of ability to communicate with the world of the dead. Now, I know we're awfully inclined to say, well, that's not really what happened here, except when you read 1 Samuel 28, it kind of does happen. Now, you might argue it wasn't this woman. You might argue that God is orchestrating this whole thing, and you wouldn't be wrong if you said that. But she is able somehow, Samuel, he shows up. He's dead. But an image of Samuel shows up, and Saul hits the ground. Because I don't know that he really bargained on this. And he says, what on earth am I going to do? Help me know what to do. Now, without stretching it too much, the same kind of thing happens with Saul of Tarsus, does it not? No, I mean, there's not a medium. The circumstances are different, but Saul is on his way to Damascus, and suddenly there is a bright light, and somebody already dead, buried, and in this case, resurrected and gone on, shows up and appears to him, and Saul falls on his face and doesn't know what to do and asks for instructions for what he needs to do next. Well, I think that's a pretty neat connection. Maybe you see that a little bit too. And the last thing, and boy, howdy, we've got about 5 minutes to get to the actual, I got another page and a half of notes here. I mean, Max says y'all to just keep sitting here till I quit, so, you can take that up with him. No, they both died fighting. They both died fighting, in a sense, one for his own kingdom, one for God's kingdom. They both gave their life fighting for a kingdom they had come to believe was worth dying for. All right, now, real quick. Oh, boy. 3 points. All right, that's what you're supposed to have in a sermon, right? I guess that was all still the introduction, too. What an intro. 3 points that show you the difference in Paul before Christ and after his encounter with Christ. Now, you might argue in some ways he wasn't changed, except he was. But he went from being super faithful to being super faithful. Well, that didn't have to change then, did he? He was already devoted and dedicated to the way of God. And yet his perspective changed when he met Jesus. And Jesus said, hey, it really is me. And you're not persecuting those people that you think you're persecuting. You actually are, in fact, persecuting me, Jesus. And so his life is changed. He goes and he meets Ananias, and there are some remarkable things that happen. And we begin reading about that in Acts chapter 8, Acts chapter 9. I encourage you to spend some time in that text. I'm going to give you some verses as we go through tonight because we just don't have the time to read, well, about 9 more passages, okay? We just don't have the time. But let me give you 3 things that I think changed in Saul's life. Once he met Jesus and once he understood the gospel really was centered around the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, who in fact was the Messiah, the anointed one of God, the Redeemer. Once he saw that, and once he was willing to give himself in submission to that, once he was willing to confess this newfound faith and lay that aside, his desire to persecute went away, and his desire became to serve Jesus. And we see him baptized, and we see later the things that he will say about that union, about that baptism and what it meant for him and what it did for him. The perspective is changing. The first thing I think we see is that he understood the beauty of suffering with Christ. Now, I don't know that he would have ever thought about that before. I think he was probably willing to suffer for the cause. He seems to be willing to endure whatever for the cause before he ever meets Jesus. But once he meets Jesus, he begins to talk. Philippians chapter 1, he talks about suffering with Christ. 1 Peter chapter 4 and Philippians chapter 3. Oh, there's some beautiful stuff there. I want you to go write that down. If you don't write it down, come back and you'll see this on Facebook later. Just fast forward the first hour and a half and get to this point. And once you get here, I want you to go spend a little time with Philippians chapter 1, especially around verse number 29. I want you to spend a little time with 1 Peter chapter 4, and I'm not even going to give you verses there. It's a short chapter. Won't take you, just read all of 1 Peter. That won't take you long either. And then Philippians chapter 3, verses 10 and 11. Some really, really rich things. What do they say to us? All of those things are pointed to this one idea. Paul says, suffering with Christ is a good thing. And it's something we ought to look for. It's something we ought to rejoice in and celebrate in. I think it took a change in perspective for him to see that and believe it. Secondly, Paul not only understood it was important to suffer with Christ, but Paul's perspective taught him it was necessary, even desirable, to die with Christ. To die with Christ. Well, that sounds odd, doesn't it? Now, if you'll allow me to go all the way back to the stuff I talked about at the very beginning before we got into the Bible, we still don't like to talk much about dying. Even in a religious context or spiritual context, we don't like to talk about that. It's frightening to us. It's uncomfortable to us. And yet Paul says, I am now crucified with Christ. I've already been on the cross with him. That's what he says in Galatians 2:20. And I'm alive, but it's not me that's living, because I died with Christ, but Christ lives in me. And I'm living this life now through that faith. Death with Christ. Romans chapter 6, it's a masterful chapter about baptism. We get caught up in some other verses sometimes about baptism, but you want a rich discussion of the meaning and the beauty and the importance of baptism to your faith in Christ. Romans chapter 6 is wonderful. And Paul directly connects baptism with death. Baptism with death and dying with Christ. And when we go into the waters of baptism, we're laying ourselves into the grave with Jesus. Real quick, let me insert this in here because it's a fantastic story, and I know we're up against it. When I lived in Fresno, we had a wonderful group of Christians who met in the same church building there from Cambodia. And they had come in the midst of the Vietnam conflict, and they had made their home in the United States through no real choice of their own, and they really didn't have anywhere to go back to. And a lot of those had come to Christ, and we were fortunate to have probably 30 or 40 Cambodians that were a faithful part of the Woodward Park Church. And I was talking to one of the men who had been with them when they finally decided to send someone back home. And he said it was amazing to go out in the countryside and see these Cambodian preachers preaching the gospel to people who were accepting the gospel and they were being baptized. But he said in Cambodia, as a general rule, the people are fairly small, and the most common thing that would have water in it is this tall water pitcher. And he said most Americans couldn't get in it. But most Cambodians could fit in it, and they would get down inside this water-filled vessel, and the baptizer would press them down into it. And he said, but I noticed as they were doing that, every time these people would start to go down in the water, the Cambodians who were around them would all say this word, slop. He said, now I grew up in Arkansas, and I knew what I thought slop meant, and I knew that didn't fit with where it was, what was happening here. He said, finally I pulled one of the Cambodian translators aside, and I said, what are they saying? And it sounds like slop. And he said, well, it is. It's the word for death. It's the word for death. They understood that as they were being immersed, they were dying with Christ. Paul had that shift in perspective, that it was about dying with Christ. But let me tell you that suffering with Christ and dying with Christ, both even now to Christians, sound a little negative, a little dark. Paul also understood the beauty of living with Christ, because that's the natural progression, right? It was for Jesus: suffering, death, and life. And Paul's perspective was so changed from his interaction with Jesus and his embrace of the gospel. He understood suffering with Christ was beautiful. Death with Christ was desirable. And it produced life with Christ. Oh, 1 Corinthians 15, he talks so much about the resurrection. And he makes a lot of points about the resurrection and about how much our faith is built on the resurrection. In fact, if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, everything we preach is, well, it's worthless. But Jesus was raised from the dead, and he begins chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians by giving us a list of witnesses. Eyewitness testimony. These people saw it. These people saw Jesus after. And he even says, I did too, in a different way. By the way, in that moment, he shows a little humility because he says, I'm not worthy to be called an apostle. I'm the least of the apostles. We sometimes would say maybe he's the greatest, but he says, no, not so. And so that brings us to where I want to end with tonight. And we will turn to this one. I will at least, because I think it's a passage worth turning to, Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, we come to about the middle of that first chapter, a little beyond the middle. And I want to come down to about verse number 21. Now, you know the text here. The context is important to us too, but for the sake of tonight, I want us to finish with this passage. Paul says, beginning in verse 21, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which to choose. But I am hard pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. And convinced of this, I know that I'll remain and continue with you all for your progress and the joy in the faith. Now, what's he talking about? Paul's in jail. He knows they're about to kill him. He knows it. I mean, it doesn't take a scientist to know that's where this thing is heading. And he's soon going to lose his head, literally, for the gospel. He knows that. It's coming. The death sentence is there. But his perspective had so changed that even facing physical death, he says, you don't understand. This actually is better. This is gain. This is reward. This is worth celebrating. Why? Because to live is Christ. To die is gain. This is life and death, but in this case, death is what leads to life. Paul saw Jesus, and once he saw Jesus, it so changed his perspective that what he centered the rest of his life around was suffering with Christ. He embraced it, and he did it. He lived it. Dying with Christ, sometimes a daily affair, perhaps, for us. Paul reminds us in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11, though, that if we die with him, we live with him. It doesn't get much more straightforward than that. And he understood that living with Christ, not just here and now, but forever, is where this path leads. That's quite a change in perspective. And tonight, perhaps, your perspective has been changed by something, maybe something that was said, maybe something God was doing that we didn't know anything about, maybe some way that the gospel has impacted you, maybe something that's been going on in your life and your heart and your mind for a long time. Maybe your perspective has been changed and you see that what you need to do tonight is to embrace a life of suffering with Christ, dying with Christ, and living with Christ. Well, I hope, if that's the case, that while we're singing this next song, you'll let somebody know that. You'll come forward if that's what you need to do. You'll grab somebody in the pew with you and tell them if that's what you need to do. And if a change needs to happen in your life, perhaps tonight, the gospel needs to be lived out in your life as you die to yourself, as you die with Christ. You're buried with him and raised with him. Maybe that's your story tonight. Maybe that's how it goes before we leave this place. If that's the case, use this opportunity. Don't waste it while we stand and sing.
I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided